The wind carried the scent of late summer corn through Maplewood, Vermont, whispering across the fields that stretched golden and endless under the August sun. Clara Bennett stood at the edge of the dirt road, her paint-splattered work boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, her eyes fixed on the old house that loomed ahead. It was a relic of New England's past, a sagging, shingle-clad farmhouse with a wraparound porch that creaked under the weight of forgotten summers. The windows were cloudy with grime, their frames peeling like skin too long exposed to the elements. Clara tightened her grip on the handle of her toolbox, feeling an odd kinship with the house. Like her, it stood alone, weathered, but still standing, holding stories no one bothered to ask about. At 32, Clara was no stranger to solitude. She'd built a life out of it piece by piece, the way she layered paint on cracked walls. Her days were spent coaxing life back into homes like this one, sanding away the scars of time, covering them with fresh coats of color. Maplewood, with its sleepy streets and farmers market chatter, was her refuge. A place where no one asked too many questions about the woman who lived in a one-bedroom apartment above the hardware store. Her evenings filled with the hum of a radio and the faint scratch of pencil on paper as she sketched half-remembered dreams. The house belonged to the Harrisons, or it had, before they'd packed up and left for the city a decade ago. Now it was up for sale, and Clara had been hired to make it presentable. Just a quick job, the realtor had said, her voice clipped over the phone. Slap some paint on the walls, make it look alive again. Clara had nodded, though she knew there was no such thing as a quick job with houses like this. Old houses held secrets, and secrets took time to uncover. She pushed open the front door, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped into a dim foyer that smelled of dust and aged wood. Sunlight filtered through the grimy windows, casting long, trembling shadows across the hardwood floor. A grandfather clock stood silent in the corner, its hands frozen at 3:30, as if time had given up on this place long ago. Clara set her toolbox down, her footsteps echoing as she wandered through the rooms. The living room held a sagging couch draped in a faded quilt, the kitchen, a rusted stove that looked like it hadn't been touched since the Reagan era. Every surface was coated in a fine layer of neglect, and yet there was something alive here, a pulse faint but undeniable in the way the house seemed to watch her. Clara's fingers brushed the wall, feeling the texture of peeling wallpaper beneath her calloused skin. She'd always liked old houses better than new ones. New houses were sterile, predictable, all straight lines, and soulless drywall. Old houses had character scars that told stories of families who'd laughed and cried within their walls. This one, though, felt heavier, as if it carried a grief too big for its brittle frame. Clara shook her head, dismissing the thought. She wasn't here to play amateur historian. She was here to paint. The realtor had asked for a neutral palette beige, maybe a soft gray to make the house appeal to buyers. Clara climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, her boots thumping against the worn treads. The upstairs was a maze of small bedrooms, their doors ajar, revealing iron bed frames and moth-eaten curtains. She checked each room, noting the cracks in the plaster, the water stains blooming like bruises on the ceilings. The work would take longer than the realtor thought, but Clara didn't mind. Time was something she had in abundance. It was the attic that stopped her. The door was at the end of the hall, half hidden behind a warped bookcase. She pushed the bookcase aside, the wood scraping against the floor, and tugged the door open. A narrow staircase spiraled upward, disappearing into darkness. Clara hesitated, her hand hovering over the light switch. Something about the attic felt different, like stepping into a memory that wasn't hers. She flicked the switch, but the bulb buzzed and died, leaving only a faint glow from the hallway below. With a sigh, she grabbed her flashlight and started up the stairs. The attic was a cavern of shadows, the air thick with dust that danced in the beam of her flashlight. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, their cardboard sagging under the weight of years. A cracked mirror leaned against one wall, reflecting nothing but darkness. Clara moved carefully, her boots stirring up clouds of dust that stung her eyes. She was here to check for leaks, to make sure the roof wouldn't betray the fresh paint she'd applied downstairs. But as she scanned the beams overhead, her light caught on something tucked in the corner, half buried under a pile of old blankets. It was a painting wrapped in a faded linen cloth. Clara knelt her knees, pressing into the gritty floor, and pulled the cloth away. The canvas was modest, no larger than a window pane. But it stole her breath. A woman stood in a field of corn, her silhouette framed against a sky streaked with the colors of dusk gold, violet, and a deep aching blue. Her face was turned slightly, her eyes fixed on something beyond the frame, her expression a mix of longing and resolve. The brushstrokes were deliberate, almost reverent, as if the artist had poured their soul into every line. Clara's heart thudded, a strange ache blooming in her chest. She'd seen plenty of old things in her work: photographs, letters, trinkets left behind by families who'd moved on. But this painting was different. It wasn't just beautiful. It was heavy with meaning, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. She turned the canvas over her fingers, brushing against the rough wood of the frame. In the dim light, she made out a signature scrawled in faded ink: Arthur Hayes, 1990. Below it, in a smaller, more careful hand, were the words, "For Emily, my light in the dark." Clara sat back on her heels, the flashlight trembling in her hand. The words felt like a confession, a plea, a promise left unfulfilled. Who was Arthur Hayes? Who was Emily? And why had this painting been left to gather dust in a forgotten attic? She thought of her own mother, the sketches she'd found as a child in a shoebox under the bed, half-finished drawings of fields and rivers, smudged with charcoal and love. Clara had been too young to understand them, then too young to ask why her mother drew with such urgency, as if she knew her time was running out. The attic seemed to close in around her, the air thick with questions. Clara wrapped the painting back in its cloth, but she couldn't bring herself to leave it behind. She carried it downstairs, her steps slow, as if the weight of the canvas was more than physical. Outside, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the cornfields in hues that echoed the painting in her arms. Clara stood on the porch, the house creaking softly behind her, and felt a pull she couldn't explain, a sense that this painting was more than a relic. It was a story, and somehow she was meant to tell it. Clara Bennett's apartment above the hardware store was a small, cluttered sanctuary. Its walls lined with paint cans and sketch pads she hadn't touched in years. The evening light spilled through a single window, casting a soft glow across the hardwood floor where she'd set the painting from the old house. It leaned against her couch, still wrapped in its faded linen shroud. But Clara could feel its presence like a guest who'd arrived uninvited and refused to leave. She stood in the kitchenette, stirring a mug of instant coffee, her eyes drifting to the canvas every few seconds. The signature, Arthur Hayes, 1990, and the inscription, "For Emily, my light in the dark," had lodged themselves in her mind, looping like a song she couldn't shake. She'd meant to leave the painting at the house. It wasn't hers after all. Taking it felt like stealing, though the Harrisons had long since abandoned anything of value in that attic. But something about the woman in the cornfield, her eyes heavy with unspoken stories, had rooted Clara to the spot. She'd carried the painting to her truck, driven it home, and now here it was, demanding her attention. Clara sipped her coffee, the bitterness grounding her, and knelt beside the canvas. She peeled back the linen, letting the flashlight's beam from yesterday be replaced by the warm light of her apartment. The woman in the painting seemed to shift under the new glow. Her silhouette sharper, her gaze more piercing, as if she were watching Clara right back. Clara's fingers traced the edge of the frame, worn smooth by time. She wasn't an art expert, her knowledge of painting stopped at the color charts in the hardware store. But she knew beauty when she saw it. This wasn't just a picture. It was a confession, a moment captured with such care it felt like a wound laid bare. The cornfield stretched endless behind the woman, each stalk painted with a precision that suggested the artist had known every blade by heart. The sky above was a tumult of gold and violet, a sunset that held both promise and loss. Clara's chest tightened, a familiar ache stirring. She thought of her mother's sketches, those fragile drawings of fields and rivers she'd found as a child hidden in a shoebox like secrets too precious to share. Her mother, Ellen, had been a dreamer, always sketching, always humming until the car accident stole her away when Clara was 9. The memory was a bruise Clara rarely pressed, but the painting pressed it for her. She turned the canvas over again, rereading the inscription. For Emily, my light in the dark. The words were intimate, almost desperate, written in a hand that trembled with emotion. Who was Emily? A daughter, a lover. And why had Arthur Hayes left this painting behind, tucked away in an attic where it could be forgotten? Clara sat back, her coffee cooling in her hands. She'd always been practical, the kind of person who fixed things, walls, roofs, broken promises. But this painting wasn't something she could fix with a brush or a hammer. It was a puzzle, and Clara had never been good at leaving puzzles unsolved. She set the mug down and grabbed her laptop, the screen flickering to life in the dim room. Maplewood wasn't a big town, barely 3,000 people, most of whom knew each other's business. But if Arthur Hayes had been a painter here in 1990, someone might remember him. She typed his name into the search bar, her fingers hesitating over the keys. The results were sparse, a few mentions of local art shows from the early 90s, a grainy photo from a community newsletter showing a man with wire-rimmed glasses and a quiet smile standing beside a canvas. Local artist Arthur Hayes to exhibit at Maplewood Harvest Festival, the caption read. The date was October 1990, the same year as the painting. Clara leaned closer, studying the man's face. He looked younger than she'd expected, his eyes bright with a passion that hadn't yet been dimmed by time. There was no mention of an Emily, no hint of what had happened to him after. Clara closed the laptop, her gaze drifting back to the painting. She thought of her mother again, the way Ellen used to sit at the kitchen table, her pencil moving in quick, sure strokes. You have to look closely, Clara, she'd said once, her voice soft as she sketched a riverbank. The world's full of details most people miss. Clara had tried to learn that lesson, but after her mother's death, she'd buried it along with the shoebox of sketches. Her father, Richard, had retreated into his own grief, moving them to Boston, where he worked long hours and left Clara to navigate her childhood alone. She'd stopped drawing, stopped looking for details, and started painting houses. Instead, something solid, something she could control. But the painting in her living room was pulling her back, forcing her to look again. She stood pacing the small space, her boots scuffing the floor. The practical thing would be to return the painting to the house, let the realtor deal with it. But practicality felt like betrayal, as if she'd be abandoning the woman in the cornfield, the artist who'd poured his heart into her creation. Clara stopped her eyes, catching on a sketch pad in the corner, untouched for years. She'd bought it on a whim after moving to Maplewood, thinking she might pick up drawing again. But it had stayed blank, a reminder of promises she hadn't kept. She grabbed the sketch pad, flipping it open to a clean page. Her pencil hovered, then began to move, tracing the outline of the woman in the painting. Not a copy, but a response, a way to understand what she was feeling. The lines were clumsy at first, her hand out of practice, but as she drew, she felt a spark. A connection to the girl she'd been, the one who'd watched her mother draw and believed the world could be beautiful. When she finished, the sketch was rough, but it held the same longing she saw in the painting, the same unspoken question. What happened to you? Clara set the pencil down, her heart racing. She couldn't explain it, but she knew she had to find Arthur Hayes. Not just to return the painting, but to understand why it felt so important, why it seemed to whisper to her in a language she didn't yet speak. She pulled out her phone and searched for the Maplewood Public Library, a squat brick building that housed old newspapers and town records. If Arthur Hayes had left a mark on this town, the library would be the place to start. She glanced at the painting one last time, the woman's eyes holding her in place. "I'll find him," Clara said softly, the words half promise, half prayer. "I'll find out who you are." Outside, the Vermont night settled over Maplewood, the crickets humming in the fields. Clara stepped onto her balcony, the air cool against her skin. The stars were bright, scattered across a sky that mirrored the painting's dusk. She felt the weight of the canvas behind her, its story pressing against her own. For the first time in years, Clara didn't feel alone. The painting was a companion, now a mystery that had chosen her. And as she stood there, listening to the whisper of the wind through the corn, she knew she was at the beginning of something, a journey that might lead her not just to Arthur Hayes, but to the parts of herself she'd buried long ago. The Maplewood Farmers Market buzzed with the kind of energy only a Saturday morning in late summer could muster. Stalls lined the town square, their tables groaning under the weight of fresh corn jars of amber honey and baskets of apples still dusted with dew. The air carried the mingled scents of kettle corn and lavender soap, while a fiddler's tune wove through the chatter of neighbors swapping stories about the weather and the harvest. Clara Bennett stood at the edge of the crowd, her hands stuffed in the pockets of her denim jacket. The painting from the old house tucked safely in her truck parked nearby. She'd come to the market not for the apples or the music, but for answers. Answers about Arthur Hayes and the woman in the cornfield, whose eyes seemed to follow her even now, miles from her apartment. Clara wasn't one for crowds. She preferred the quiet of her work, the rhythm of a paintbrush against a wall, the solitude that let her thoughts wander without interruption. But the market was where Maplewood's memory lived, where the old-timers gathered to trade gossip as freely as they traded zucchini. If anyone knew about Arthur Hayes, it would be here among the weathered faces and worn flannel shirts. She adjusted the baseball cap, shading her eyes, and scanned the stalls, her gaze settling on a woman with silver hair braided down her back, arranging jars of homemade jam with the precision of a curator. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, the unofficial historian of Maplewood, who'd been selling her preserves at this market since Clara was a kid. Clara approached the stall, her boots crunching on the gravel path. "Morning, Mrs. Carter," she said, offering a small smile. Evelyn looked up, her eyes crinkling at the corners, sharp, despite her 70-odd years. "Clara Bennett," she replied, her Vermont accent thick as maple syrup. "Haven't seen you at the market in ages. You here for my raspberry jam or something else?" Clara hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of her jacket pocket where she'd tucked a folded printout of the article she'd found online. "Something else," she admitted. "I'm looking for information about a man named Arthur Hayes, a painter from around here back in the 90s. Evelyn's hands paused over a jar of blackberry jam, her expression shifting from warmth to something guarded, like a door half closed. "Arthur Hayes," she repeated, her voice softer now, as if the name carried weight. "That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. What's got you asking about him?" Clara pulled out the article, smoothing it on the table. The grainy photo of Arthur stared up at them, his smile frozen in 1990. "I found a painting in the old Harrison house," she said. "It's signed by him. There's an inscription on the back for someone named Emily. I just need to know who he was, why he left it behind." Evelyn studied the article, her lips pressing into a thin line. Clara watched her, her heart thudding with a mix of hope and unease. She wasn't sure why this mattered so much, why the painting felt like a thread she had to follow. Maybe it was the way it echoed her mother's sketches, the way it stirred memories she'd buried under years of paint and pragmatism. Or maybe it was simpler, a need to give the painting back to someone who'd care, someone who'd understand its weight. Evelyn handed the article back, her eyes meeting Clara's with a knowing look. Arthur was a good man, she said finally. Talented, too. Used to show his paintings at the Harvest Festival back when Maplewood still had a proper art scene. Folks said he could capture a sunset like nobody else. Clara leaned closer, her voice low. What happened to him? Evelyn sighed, setting the jam jar down with a soft clink. He lived out on the edge of town, in that little house by the cornfields. Painted every day, taught art classes at the community center. Had a daughter, Emily, sweet girl, maybe 10 or 11 when I last saw her. But something went wrong between them. Nobody knows the whole story. Arthur wasn't one to air his troubles. But Emily left home when she was barely 18. After that, Arthur just faded. Stopped showing his work, stopped coming to town. Folks said he moved away, maybe up to the Green Mountains. Nobody's seen him in years. Clara's chest tightened, the inscription flashing in her mind. For Emily, my light in the dark. She imagined a girl young and full of dreams, leaving behind a father who'd painted her a world of cornfields and sunsets. Do you know where he went? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn shook her head. Not exactly. But I've got an old address book at home from when I organized the festival. Might have something in there. Come by tomorrow, I'll dig it out for you. Clara nodded, gratitude mixing with impatience. Thanks, Mrs. Carter. I'd appreciate that. As she turned to leave, Evelyn called after her. Clara, why's this painting got you so curious? You're not one to chase ghosts. Clara paused, her hand tightening on the article. She thought of her mother, Ellen, the way she'd sit at their kitchen table in Boston, sketching rivers and fields with a pencil that never stopped moving. Clara had been 9 when the accident took her 9 when her father packed up their lives and left Vermont for good. She'd stopped asking questions after that, stopped looking for answers in the things her mother left behind. But the painting was different. It wasn't just a relic. It was a call, a whisper from someone else's past that felt tangled with her own. I don't know. She admitted, her voice soft against the hum of the market. It just feels like it matters. Evelyn nodded, her eyes softening. Some things do, whether we understand them or not. Be careful, Clara. Old stories have a way of pulling you in deeper than you expect. Clara walked back to her truck, the market's noise fading behind her. The painting waited in the passenger seat, its linen cover slipping slightly, revealing the edge of the cornfield. She climbed in her hands, resting on the steering wheel, her mind racing. Emily, a girl who'd left home. Arthur, a father who'd stopped painting. And this canvas left behind, like a letter never sent. Clara thought of her own father, Richard, the way he'd shut down after her mother's death, his silences louder than any words. She'd tried calling him once a year ago, but the conversation had been a wall of clipped sentences and old hurts. She hadn't tried again. The sun was climbing higher now, bathing Maplewood in a golden haze. Clara started the engine, her resolve hardening. She'd go to the library tomorrow after visiting Evelyn. She'd find that address track down Arthur Hayes and return the painting to him, not because it was practical, but because it felt right, like repainting a wall to cover a crack. As she drove past the cornfields, their stalks swaying in the breeze, she felt the painting's presence beside her, its whisper growing louder. It was a story, and Clara was part of it now, whether she was ready or not. The road to the Green Mountains wound through a landscape of rolling hills and dense forests, where the late summer light dappled the asphalt in shifting patterns of gold and shadow. Clara Bennett gripped the steering wheel of her old pickup truck, the painting from the Harrison house secured in the passenger seat, its linen cover catching the breeze from the cracked window. The address Evelyn Carter had given her was scrawled on a Post-it note stuck to the dashboard, 17 Pine Hollow Lane, Willow Creek, VT. 40 miles from Maplewood, it felt like another world, one where the clamor of the farmer's market gave way to the quiet hum of cicadas and the distant rush of a river. Clara's heart thudded with a mix of anticipation and unease. She wasn't sure what she'd find at the end of this road. But the painting's weight beside her felt like a promise she couldn't break. Willow Creek was barely a village, more a scattering of clapboard houses and barns nestled against the foothills of the Green Mountains. The main street held a general store, a post office, and a diner with a neon sign that flickered open in tired blinks. Clara slowed as she passed a hand-painted sign for Pine Hollow Lane, turning onto a gravel road that crunched under her tires. The houses here were sparse, their yards overgrown with wildflowers and rusted tractors. Number 17 was at the end, a small weathered cabin with a sagging porch and a tin roof streaked with moss. A handmade sign by the mailbox read, "Hayes Woodworks," the letters carved with a precision that spoke of care, if not pride. Clara parked her boots sinking into the soft earth as she stepped out. The air smelled of pine and sawdust, and from somewhere behind the cabin came the rhythmic tap of a hammer. She hesitated, the painting tucked under her arm, its linen cover now speckled with dust from the drive. What was she doing here? She wasn't a detective, not even a proper historian. She was a painter, a house painter, not an artist, chasing a name from a canvas she'd found in an attic. But the inscription, "For Emily," my light in the dark, had burrowed into her stirring memories of her own mother's sketches, the way they'd held fragments of a love Clara had lost too soon. She couldn't walk away, not yet. She knocked on the cabin's door, the sound sharp in the quiet afternoon. No answer. The hammering continued steady and unhurried. Clara followed the sound around the side of the house, where a lean-to workshop stood open to the air. A man bent over a workbench, his silver hair catching the light as he sanded a wooden chair with careful, deliberate strokes. He was older than the photo from the 1990 article, mid-60s maybe, with deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth, but there was no mistaking him. Arthur Hayes. His hands moved with the same precision Clara had seen in the painting's brushstrokes, each motion a quiet act of devotion. "Mr. Hayes. Mr. Hayes." Clara's voice felt too loud, cutting through the hum of the forest. The man looked up, his eyes, a pale blue, that seemed to hold both curiosity and caution. He set the sandpaper down, wiping his hands on a rag that hung from his belt. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low with a gravelly edge that spoke of years spent in silence. "I'm Clara Bennett," she said, stepping closer. "I'm from Maplewood. I found something I think belongs to you." She unwrapped the painting, holding it up so the light caught the cornfield and the woman's silhouette. Arthur's face changed the caution, giving way to something raw, unguarded. His hand reached out, then stopped as if touching the canvas might burn him. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "In the attic of the old Harrison house," Clara said. "It was hidden under some blankets. Your name's on it, and there's an inscription. For Emily." She watched his reaction, her heart pounding. Arthur's gaze lingered on the painting, his eyes tracing the woman's form as if seeing her for the first time. "That was a long time ago," he said finally, turning back to his workbench. "You should keep it, or sell it. Doesn't matter." Clara frowned, the dismissal stinging more than it should. "It matters to me," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "This painting, it's not just a thing, it's a story. I want to know what it means." Arthur's hand stilled the rag twisting in his fingers. For a moment she thought he'd send her away. But then he sighed, a sound heavy with years of unspoken grief. "You don't know what you're asking," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "Some stories are better left buried." Clara's chest tightened, a familiar ache rising. She thought of her mother, Ellen, the way her sketches had been tucked away, in a shoebox, hidden from the world, after her death. Clara had buried those sketches too, along with the questions she'd never asked. the love she'd never fully understood. Maybe she said softly, "But I can't leave it alone. Not this." She held the painting out in offering a challenge. Arthur stared at it, his expression a tangle of pain and memory. "Come back tomorrow," he said at last, his voice rough. "Bring the painting. But don't ask about Emily. Not yet." Clara nodded, sensing the fragility of the moment. She wrapped the painting back in its cloth, her fingers lingering on the edge. As she walked back to her truck, the hammer resumed its steady tap, but it felt different now, like a heartbeat struggling to find its rhythm. She glanced back at the cabin, Arthur's silhouette framed against the workshop's open wall. He was a man carrying a wound, just like the house she'd found the painting in, just like her. Clara climbed into her truck, the post-it note with his address still stuck to the dashboard. She didn't know what she'd find when she came back tomorrow, but she knew she couldn't stop now. The painting was more than a canvas. It was a map leading her somewhere she hadn't expected to go. Driving back through the green mountains, the forest closing in around her, Clara felt the weight of her own past pressing closer. Her mother's sketches, her father's silence, the years she'd spent painting over her own grief. They were all stirring now, awakened by a stranger's painting, and a name she didn't yet understand. Emily. The word felt like a key, one she'd have to turn carefully. As the sun dipped below the hills, casting long shadows across the road, Clara whispered to herself, "I'm not done yet." The painting in the seat beside her seemed to agree, its whisper growing louder with every mile. The morning mist clung to the green mountains like a veil, softening the edges of the pines as Clara Bennett's truck rattled down Pine Hollow Lane. The painting from the Harrison house sat beside her, its linen cover folded back, the woman in the cornfield, gazing out as if urging Clara forward. The air was cool, heavy with the promise of autumn, and Clara's breath fogged the windshield as she parked outside Arthur Hayes's cabin. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the chill, but from the weight of what she was about to do. Yesterday, Arthur had let her in just barely, but his warning not to ask about Emily lingered like a locked door. Clara wasn't sure she could honor it. The painting demanded answers, and so did the ache in her chest, the one that had stirred ever since she'd found it. She stepped out, the gravel crunching under her boots, and carried the painting to the workshop, where she'd found Arthur the day before. The lean-to was open, its interior a clutter of half-finished chairs and tables. The air thick with the scent of sawdust and linseed oil. Arthur was there, bent over a workbench, his hands moving a plane across a plank of cedar with a rhythm that felt almost meditative. He didn't look up as Clara approached, but the slight tightening of his shoulders told her he knew she was there. "You came back," he said, his voice low, rough as the wood he worked. "Didn't think you would." "I said I would," Clara replied, setting the painting against a nearby stool. The canvas caught the morning light, the woman's silhouette sharp against the golden cornfield. Arthur's eyes flicked to it, then away, as if the sight burned. Clara hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of her jacket. She'd spent the night replaying their brief conversation, piecing together the fragments Evelyn Carter had given her about Arthur and Emily. A father and daughter torn apart by something unspoken. A painting left behind, like a letter never sent. "I need to know about this," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "About you. About Emily." Arthur set the plane down, his movements slow, deliberate. He wiped his hands on the rag tucked into his belt, his face a mask of lines and shadows. "I told you not to ask about her," he said. But there was no anger in his voice, only a weariness that seemed to seep from his bones. He turned to face her, his pale blue eyes catching the light, and for a moment Clara saw the man from the 1990 article, the artist with a spark in his gaze, before time and loss had dulled it. "You don't know what you're digging up, Clara. Some things are better left alone." Clara's throat tightened. She thought of her own past, the shoebox of her mother's sketches, hidden under her childhood bed, the way she'd buried them after Ellen's death. She'd spent years painting over her grief, layering it with beige and gray. But this canvas had cracked that surface open. "I can't leave it alone," she said softly. "This painting, it's not just a thing. It's a piece of someone's heart. Yours, I think. And I know what it's like to lose that." Her voice wavered and she looked away, her eyes stinging. She hadn't meant to say so much, but the words had slipped out raw and unfiltered. Arthur studied her, his expression softening, though his hand still gripped the rag like a lifeline. He gestured to a pair of stools by the workbench. "Sit," he said, his voice gruff, but not unkind. Clara sat, the painting between them, its presence a silent third party. Arthur took the other stool, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of memory had finally caught up. "I painted that for Emily," he said at last. His eyes fixed on the canvas. She was 9. Loved the cornfields, used to run through them until her dress was covered in dust. I'd watch her from the porch, thinking she was the brightest thing in the world. That's what I wanted to capture, her light. Clara listened, her heart aching at the tenderness in his voice. She could see it, a girl laughing in the fields, her father watching with a paintbrush in hand, trying to hold on to a moment that would slip away. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Arthur's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he'd shut her out again. But then he sighed, a sound like wind through a broken window. "She wanted to be a musician," he said. "Played the guitars, sang like she was born for it. But I saw what that world did to people, chewed them up, spit them out. I told her it was a foolish dream, that she'd get hurt. We fought. Bad. She was 18 when she left. Said she didn't need me holding her back. That was 17 years ago." The words hung in the air, heavy with regret. Clara's mind flashed to her own father, Richard, the way his silence had built a wall between them after her mother's death. She'd been 9, too young to fight back, too young to understand why he'd stopped looking at her the way he used to. "Did you try to find her?" she asked, her voice trembling with her own unspoken questions. Arthur shook his head, his eyes distant. "I wrote letters at first. Sent them to every address I could find. Never got an answer. After a while, I stopped painting, stopped everything. Moved here, started fixing things instead of creating them. It's easier that way." He gestured to the workshop, the chairs and tables lined up like soldiers in a war he'd already lost. "I thought she was gone for good. Maybe she is." Clara's chest tightened, the painting's inscription echoing in her mind. "For Emily, my light in the dark." She wanted to reach out to tell Arthur he was wrong, that Emily might still be out there waiting for a reason to come back. But she saw the pain in his eyes, the kind that had settled in like a permanent guest, and she knew words wouldn't be enough. "This painting," she said, her hand resting on the canvas, "it's not just a memory. It's a promise. Maybe it's not too late." Arthur looked at her, his gaze searching, as if trying to decide whether she was naive or brave. "You don't know what you're asking," he said again. But this time there was a crack in his voice, a flicker of hope he couldn't quite bury. Clara stood, her resolve hardening. "Maybe not," she said. "But I'm going to find out." She picked up the painting, its weight familiar now, like an extension of herself. As she walked back to her truck, the morning mist lifting to reveal the green mountains in all their quiet majesty, she felt the whisper of the canvas growing louder. It was leading her somewhere, and for the first time in years, Clara wasn't afraid to follow. The drive to Burlington was a blur of green hills and fleeting glimpses of Lake Champlain, its waters glinting under the late August sun. Clara Bennett's truck hummed along Route 7. The painting from Arthur Hayes's past, tucked securely in the back, wrapped in its linen shroud, like a secret she was only beginning to unravel. The post-it note with Arthur's address still clung to her dashboard, but now it was joined by a new scrap of paper. A name and address scrawled in her own hurried handwriting. Maggie Sullivan, The Rusty Note Cafe, Church Street. Maggie, a friend of Evelyn Carter's from the old Maplewood art scene, had known Emily Hayes in her music days. If anyone could point Clara toward Emily, it was her. Burlington felt like a different world from the quiet of Maplewood or the seclusion of Willow Creek. The city buzzed with life college students spilling out of bookstores, street musicians strumming guitars on Church Street Marketplace, the air thick with the scent of coffee and fresh-baked bread. Clara parked near the cafe, her boots heavy on the cobblestone street as she carried the painting under her arm. She wasn't sure why she'd brought it. Maybe it was the way it anchored her, a reminder of why she was here. Arthur's story had cracked something open in her, a longing she hadn't let herself feel since her mother's death. She thought of Ellen's sketches, those fragile lines capturing rivers and fields, and how she'd stopped drawing after the accident, as if putting pencil to paper would summon too much pain. The painting, though, was pulling her back, forcing her to look at the things she'd buried. The Rusty Note Cafe was a narrow brick-walled space with mismatched tables and a stage barely big enough for a single performer. A faded poster on the wall advertised open mic nights, its edges curling like old memories. Clara spotted Maggie behind the counter, a woman in her late 50s with a shock of red hair tied back in a messy bun, her hands moving deftly as she poured espresso. "Maggie Sullivan?" Clara asked, stepping up to the counter. Maggie glanced up, her green eyes sharp and curious. "That's me," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You must be Clara, the one Evelyn called about. Said you're chasing a ghost from Maplewood." Clara managed a small smile, setting the painting against the counter. "Something like that," she said. "I'm looking for Emily Hayes. I found a painting her father made for her back in 1990. I'm trying to get it back to her." Maggie's expression softened, but there was a flicker of sadness in her eyes, like someone who'd seen too many dreams falter. "Emily," she said, her voice low. "Haven't heard that name in a while. She used to play here, you know, back when this place was more bar than cafe. Had a voice like nothing else, raw, like she was singing her soul out." Clara's heart quickened. She leaned closer, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Do you know where she is now?" Maggie sighed, glancing at the painting as if it held answers she didn't. "Emily was a star waiting to happen," she said. "Played every open mic from here to Montpelier. Wrote her own songs, too, about love loss, the way the mountains look at dusk. But the music world's brutal. She got a shot at a record deal in Boston early 2000s, but it fell through. Bad manager, bad timing. Broke her heart. Last I heard, she gave up singing. Moved to the suburbs, started teaching music at a school. Keeps to herself now." Clara's chest tightened at Arthur's words echoing in her mind. "I told her it was a foolish dream that she'd get hurt. She imagined Emily young and full of fire, chasing a dream, only to have it slip through her fingers. It wasn't just the music world that had broken her. It was the fight with her father, the weight of his doubt. Clara knew that kind of weight. Her father Richard had never told her to stop drawing, but his silence after her mother's death had been its own kind of dismissal. "Do you know where she's teaching?" Clara asked, her voice steady, despite the ache in her throat. Maggie nodded, scribbling an address on a napkin. "Westview Elementary, just outside town. She's there most days, teaching kids to play Twinkle, Twinkle on plastic recorders." "But Clara," she added, her eyes meeting Clara's with a warning. "Emily's not the girl she was. She's built walls higher than these mountains. Don't expect her to welcome you with open arms." Clara took the napkin, her fingers brushing the rough paper. "Thanks, Maggie," she said, her voice soft. She picked up the painting, its weight familiar now, like a friend who knew her secrets. As she stepped back onto Church Street, the bustle of Burlington closed in around her, laughter music, the clink of coffee cups. But Clara felt apart from it, her thoughts tangled with Emily's story. A girl who'd run from her father's warnings, only to find the world just as harsh as he'd feared. Clara wondered what Emily saw when she looked back. Regret, anger, or something softer. Something that might still yearn for the cornfields of Maplewood. She climbed into her truck, the napkin tucked into her pocket. The drive to Westview Elementary wasn't far, but it felt like a leap into the unknown. Clara glanced at the painting in the back, the woman's silhouette catching the fading light. She thought of her mother Ellen, the way she'd drawn with such urgency, as if she knew her time was short. Clara had stopped drawing after the accident, afraid of what those lines might unearth. But now, chasing Emily, she felt a spark of that old urgency, a need to connect the pieces of a story that wasn't entirely her own. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in hues of gold and violet, not unlike the painting's dusk. Clara's hands tightened on the wheel, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what she'd find at Westview Elementary or whether Emily would even talk to her. But she knew she couldn't stop now. The painting was more than a canvas. It was a bridge spanning the years between a father and daughter, between Clara's past and the woman she was becoming. As Burlington's lights faded in her rearview mirror, Clara whispered to herself, "Just one more step." The painting seemed to hum in agreement, its whisper carrying her forward into the gathering dusk. The late afternoon sun hung low over the suburbs of Burlington, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt of Westview Elementary's parking lot. Clara Bennett's truck idled outside the school, its engine a soft rumble against the quiet of the late summer day. The painting from Arthur Hayes's past sat in the passenger seat, its linen cover folded back, the woman in the cornfield, staring out with eyes that seemed to know too much. Clara's fingers tightened on the steering wheel, her heart a steady drumbeat of nerves and determination. The napkin with the school's address scribbled by Maggie Sullivan lay crumpled in her pocket, a fragile map to the next piece of the puzzle. Emily Hayes was here teaching music to children, her dreams of stardom buried somewhere along the way. Clara wasn't sure what she'd say, or if Emily would even listen, but the painting demanded this moment, and Clara couldn't turn back now. The school was a low red brick building, its walls adorned with faded murals of smiling suns and musical notes. Clara parked and stepped out, the painting tucked under her arm, its weight both anchor and burden. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and chalk dust, a reminder of childhoods long past hers included. She thought of her mother Ellen, the way she'd hum folk songs while sketching, her voice weaving through their small Vermont home like a thread holding it together. Clara had been 9 when that thread snapped, leaving her and her father Richard to drift in their separate silences. The painting with its inscription, "For Emily, my light in the dark," felt like a chance to mend something, even if it wasn't her own broken past. Inside the school was quiet, the hallways echoing with the faint squeak of Clara's boots on polished linoleum. A janitor pointed her toward the music room down a corridor lined with construction paper cutouts of guitars and drums. Through the door's small window, Clara saw a woman at a piano, her fingers coaxing a simple melody from the keys as a group of children packed up their recorders. Emily Hayes. She was 35, Maggie had said, but she looked both younger and older. Her dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail, her face unlined but shadowed, as if joy had been rationed out sparingly over the years. Clara knocked softly, and Emily looked up, her hazel eyes wary but kind. "Can I help you?" Emily asked, her voice clear but guarded as the last child scurried out. Clara stepped inside, the painting heavy in her hands. "I'm Clara Bennett," she said, her throat tight. "I'm from Maplewood. I found something I think belongs to you." She unwrapped the painting, holding it up so the light caught the cornfield's golden hues. Emily's breath caught her hand, freezing on the piano keys. For a moment she was still, her eyes locked on the canvas, the woman in the field staring back like a ghost from another life. "Where did you get that?" Emily's voice was barely audible, a mix of wonder and pain. Clara lowered the painting, resting it against a chair. "In the attic of an old house in Maplewood," she said. "It's signed by Arthur Hayes. Your father, I'm guessing. There's an inscription on the back for you." She turned the canvas, revealing the words, "For Emily, my light in the dark." Emily's face crumpled just for a second before she steadied herself, her hands folding tightly in her lap. "That was a long time ago," she said, her tone clipped as if closing a door. "I don't need it. You can keep it or give it away." Clara's chest ached at the dismissal, so like Arthur's when she'd first shown him the painting. She saw the same pain in Emily's eyes, the same walls built to keep the past at bay. "I met your father," Clara said, pushing forward despite the risk. "In Willow Creek. He's still there working with wood now, not painting. He told me about you, about how you left." Emily's gaze sharpened, a flash of anger cutting through her calm. "He told you I left?" she said, her voice rising. "Did he tell you why? Did he tell you how he said my music was a waste, that I'd never make it? That I was throwing my life away?" Clara swallowed, her hands tightening on the painting's frame. She thought of her own father, Richard, the way his silence had felt like a judgment, pushing her to bury her mother's sketches and her own dreams of drawing. "He regrets it," she said softly. "He told me he was wrong, that he should have believed in you. He's been carrying that for 17 years. Emily looked away, her jaw tight, her fingers tracing the piano keys without sound. "He doesn't get to regret it now," she said, her voice breaking. "He made his choice. So did I." The room felt smaller, the air thick with unspoken hurts. Clara wanted to argue, to tell Emily that the painting was proof of Arthur's love, that it could bridge the years between them. But she saw the rawness in Emily's eyes, the way her hands trembled despite her resolve. Clara knew that kind of pain. Her own had kept her from calling her father for years, from picking up a pencil to draw the way her mother had taught her. "I'm not here to force you," Clara said, her voice gentle. "I just thought you should have this. It's yours, Emily. He made it for you." Emily stared at the painting, her expression a tangle of longing and fear. "I used to love that field," she said, almost to herself. "I'd run through it pretending I was on a stage singing to the corn like it was a crowd. He'd watch from the porch sketching. I thought he was proud of me." Her voice cracked and she stood abruptly, turning to gather her things. "Thank you for bringing it," she said, her back to Clara. "But I can't go back there." Clara nodded, her heart heavy. She set the painting on the piano, its presence a quiet plea. "I'll leave it here," she said, "just in case." She turned to go, her boots echoing in the empty room. As she reached the door, Emily's voice stopped her. "Why do you care?" she asked, her tone sharp but curious. "Why go through all this for a painting?" Clara paused, her hand on the doorknob. She thought of her mother's sketches, the shoebox she'd hidden away, the silence that had grown between her and her father. "Because some things are worth finding," she said, her voice steady, "even if they hurt." Outside, the sun was sinking, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, like the dusk in Arthur's painting. Clara climbed into her truck, her hands shaking as she gripped the wheel. Emily's pain had mirrored her own, a reminder of the walls she'd built to keep her own grief at bay. She didn't know if Emily would keep the painting or if she'd ever reach out to Arthur. But as she drove back toward Maplewood, the cornfields stretching endless on either side, Clara felt a spark of hope. The painting had brought her this far, whispering its story through the years. Maybe, just maybe, it could carry Emily a little closer to home. The road back to Maplewood stretched out like a ribbon under the gathering dusk. The Vermont hills fading into silhouettes against a sky bruised with violet and gold. Clara Bennett's truck rumbled along its headlights, cutting through the twilight. But her mind was elsewhere, tangled in the echo of Emily Hayes's voice, sharp with pain, soft with memory. The painting was no longer with her. She'd left it on the piano in Emily's music room, a silent offering to a woman who'd built walls higher than the Green Mountains. Clara's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles pale. She'd done what she could, but the weight of Emily's refusal, the raw ache in her eyes, clung to Clara like damp air. It wasn't just Emily's story that haunted her now. It was her own. The lights of Maplewood flickered into view the town's sleepy streets, a contrast to the restless churn of Clara's thoughts. She pulled into the lot behind the hardware store, her apartment waiting above its single window, glowing faintly against the dark. She climbed the stairs, her boots heavy, and stepped into the familiar clutter of her small sanctuary. Paint cans lined the walls, their labels faded from years of use. Her sketch pad sat untouched on the coffee table, the rough drawing of the woman in the cornfield, staring up at her, a ghost of the painting she'd left behind. Clara dropped her keys on the counter, her gaze drifting to the corner where a cardboard box sat, its edges worn from years of being pushed out of sight. She hadn't opened that box in a decade, not since she'd moved to Maplewood to escape the weight of Boston and her father's silence. But tonight, with Emily's words, "He doesn't get to regret it now," still ringing in her ears, Clara felt the pull of it sharp and insistent. She knelt beside the box, her fingers trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside were her mother's sketches, dozens of them, folded carefully in a shoebox that smelled faintly of charcoal and time. Ellen Bennett had been a dreamer, her pencil capturing rivers, fields, and the soft curve of a child's face. Clara's face in lines so delicate they seemed to breathe. Clara pulled out a sketch of a Vermont meadow, the grass swaying under a sky heavy with clouds. Her mother's initials, E.B., were scrawled in the corner, a quiet claim to a moment she'd never see again. Clara's throat tightened, her eyes stinging as she traced the lines. She'd been 9 when Ellen died, her car skidding off a rain-slicked road one November night. The accident had left Clara with a father who didn't know how to grieve a man who buried his pain in work and left his daughter to navigate hers alone. Richard had packed up their Vermont home, moved them to Boston, and filled their new apartment with silence. Clara had stopped drawing, then afraid that each stroke of her pencil would summon her mother's ghost, or worse, her father's disapproval. She'd tucked the shoebox away, telling herself it was easier to forget to paint houses instead of memories. But the painting from the Harrison house had changed that. Arthur's canvas, with its woman in the cornfield, had stirred something in Clara, a longing she'd buried under layers of practicality. She thought of Emily standing in that music room, her voice breaking as she spoke of her father's betrayal. Clara understood that pain, the way it could harden into a wall, keeping love at bay. She'd built her own walls, hadn't she? After her mother's death, she'd stopped calling her father, stopped trying to bridge the gap between them. The last time they'd spoken a year ago, his voice had been clipped distant, as if her presence was a reminder of everything he'd lost. Clara had hung up, vowing not to try again. She set the sketch down, her hands shaking. The painting wasn't just about Arthur and Emily. It was about her, too. Finding it in that attic, chasing its story through Willow Creek and Burlington, had forced her to look at her own past, the parts she'd painted over with beige and gray. She thought of her mother's voice, soft and sure, saying, "Look closely, Clara. The world's full of details most people miss." Clara had stopped looking, stopped seeing, but the painting had brought her back to that lesson. She wasn't just helping Arthur and Emily. She was searching for herself, for the girl who'd once believed in beauty and love, in the possibility of mending what was broken. Clara stood pacing the small apartment, her boots scuffing the hardwood floor. She couldn't force Emily to see Arthur, couldn't make her forgive him. But she couldn't walk away either. The painting was a promise, a thread connecting a father and daughter. and maybe, just maybe, it could connect Clara to her own past. She stopped at the window, the lights of Maplewood twinkling below, like stars scattered across the earth. She thought of her father alone in his Boston apartment, surrounded by the same silence that had driven her away. What if she called him now? What if she tried one more time to bridge the gap? She pulled her phone from her pocket, her thumb hovering over his number. Her heart pounded a mix of fear and hope. She pressed call, holding her breath as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Hello?" Richard's voice was gruff, unchanged by the years. Clara swallowed her voice, catching. "Dad, it's me," she said. I wanted to talk." There was a long pause, the kind that felt like a lifetime. "Clara," he said, finally, his tone flat. "It's late. I've got an early morning." The words were a wall familiar and impenetrable. Clara's eyes stung, but she forced her voice to stay steady. "Okay," she said. "Maybe another time." She hung up the silence of her apartment, rushing in to fill the void. Clara sank onto the couch, the shoebox of sketches at her feet. She felt empty, hollowed out, but beneath that was a spark of resolve. Arthur and Emily's story wasn't over, and neither was hers. She'd left the painting with Emily, a seed planted in uncertain soil. Maybe it would take root, maybe it wouldn't, but Clara wasn't done trying. She picked up her sketch pad, the drawing of the woman in the cornfield staring back at her. Her pencil moved, adding a new line, a shadow, a detail she hadn't seen before. It wasn't just art. It was a way forward, a way to keep looking, to keep believing that some things, some people were worth finding. As the night deepened outside, Clara drew her heart whispering in time with the painting's call pulling her toward the next step. The morning sun filtered through the pines of Willow Creek, casting dappled light across the gravel path to Arthur Hayes's cabin. Clara Bennett's truck crunched to a stop, its engine fading into the quiet hum of the Green Mountains. She stepped out, her boots heavy with purpose, a folded piece of paper tucked in her jacket pocket. A letter she'd written last night, pretending it was from Emily. It was a risk, maybe a reckless one. But after leaving the painting with Emily and facing her father's rejection on the phone, Clara felt a desperate need to push forward. The painting's whisper had become a roar in her heart, urging her to bridge the gap between Arthur and his daughter, even if it meant bending the truth. The workshop door was open, as it had been before, the air inside thick with the scent of cedar and varnish. Arthur was at his workbench, shaping a table leg with a chisel, his movements slow, almost mournful. He didn't look up as Clara approached, but the slight pause in his work told her he knew she was there. "You're persistent," he said, his voice rough like gravel underfoot. "Thought you'd be done with me by now." Clara managed a small smile, stepping into the workshop's dim light. "Not yet," she said, her fingers brushing the paper in her pocket. "I went to Burlington. I found Emily." Arthur's chisel froze mid-stroke, the blade glinting in the sunlight. His shoulders stiffened, and when he looked up, his pale blue eyes held a storm of emotions, hope, fear, and something deeper, something that looked like shame. "You saw her?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Clara nodded, her throat tight. "She's teaching music at a school outside town. She's okay, but she's carrying a lot." I showed her the painting. "She didn't want to keep it, but I left it with her." Arthur set the chisel down, his hands trembling slightly as he wiped them on his rag. "She didn't want it." He repeated the words heavy, as if they confirmed a truth he'd long feared. He turned away, his gaze drifting to the window where the mountains loomed like silent witnesses. "I don't blame her. After what I said, what I did, I told her she'd fail Clara. Told her music was a pipe dream, that she'd end up broken. And she left. I drove her away." Clara's chest ached, Arthur's words echoing her own memories of her father Richard, whose silence had been its own kind of dismissal. She thought of the call last night, the way his curt voice had shut her out, leaving her to cradle her mother's sketches alone. "You were trying to protect her," she said, stepping closer. "You were scared for her. That's not the same as not loving her." Arthur shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. "Love doesn't mean much when you tear someone's dreams apart. I saw the world out there, musicians chewed up by producers' clubs, broken promises. I thought I was saving her, but all I did was break her trust." He sank onto a stool, his hands clasped tightly as if holding himself together. Clara sat across from him, the workbench between them littered with wood shavings and tools. She saw the man from the 1990 article, the artist with a spark in his eyes, now dimmed by years of regret. "She was my light," he said, his voice cracking. "Every painting I made, every stroke was for her. That one you found, I painted it the summer before she left. We'd sit in the cornfields, her singing, me sketching. I thought we'd have forever. But I pushed too hard, said things I can't take back. She stopped singing to me after that." Clara's eyes stung, the weight of Arthur's grief pulling at her own. She thought of her mother, Ellen, the way her sketches had captured moments Clara could barely remember: a meadow, a river, her own small hand reaching for a flower. After Ellen's death, Clara had stopped drawing, afraid of the pain it would summon. "I found something in your workshop last time," she said, her voice soft. "A letter from Emily. She wrote that she'd come back when you were ready to listen." Arthur's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "That's not possible," he said. "She never wrote to me." Clara hesitated, then pulled the fake letter from her pocket. I wrote this," she admitted, unfolding it. "It's what I think she'd say if she could. That she's waiting, Arthur. That she still loves you, even if she's hurt." She slid the paper across the workbench, her heart pounding. Arthur stared at it, his hands unmoving. "You had no right," he said, his voice low. But there was no anger, only a raw vulnerability that made Clara's breath catch. He picked up the letter, his fingers trembling as he read the words she'd crafted. "Dad, I'm still here. I just need you to hear me." For a long moment he was silent, his eyes tracing the lines as if they held Emily's voice. Then a tear fell soaking into the paper, and Arthur's shoulders shook. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "I don't deserve her forgiveness." Clara leaned forward, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Maybe not. But she deserves to know you're sorry. You can't change the past, but you can give her a chance to heal." Arthur looked at her, his eyes glistening with tears he didn't try to hide. "Why are you doing this, Clara? Why does it matter so much?" She swallowed, thinking of her mother's shoebox, her father's silence, the sketch pad she'd started to fill again. "Because I know what it's like to lose someone," she said. "My mom died when I was 9, my dad. He shut me out. I've spent years running from that pain, but this painting, your story, it's making me face it. I think it can do the same for you and Emily." Arthur nodded slowly, his hands clutching the letter. "Write one for me," he said, his voice hoarse. "A real one. To her. I'll tell her everything I should have said back then." Clara's heart lifted, a spark of hope igniting. She handed him a blank sheet of paper from her bag, her fingers brushing his calloused ones. "Tell her the truth," she said. "That's all she needs." As Arthur began to write, his pen moving haltingly across the page, Clara stepped outside, giving him space. The green mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks softened by morning mist. She thought of her own father, the call that had ended in rejection, and wondered if she'd ever find the courage to try again. But for now, she was here helping Arthur take a step toward his daughter. The painting's whisper had brought her this far, and as the sun climbed higher, Clara felt it urging her forward toward a reunion that might heal more than one broken heart. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, its edges worn from the journey. The handwriting on the front, unmistakably careful, deliberate as if each letter carried a weight too heavy for ink alone. Emily Hayes stood in her small Burlington apartment, the late afternoon light filtering through the blinds, casting stripes across the linoleum floor. The letter trembled in her hands, the return address reading Willow Creek, VT. Arthur Hayes. Her father. She hadn't seen his handwriting in 17 years, not since she'd packed a bag and left Maplewood, her guitar slung over her shoulder, his words. You'll never make it ringing in her ears like a song she couldn't unlearn. She set the envelope on the kitchen counter, her heart pounding, and turned away, as if ignoring it could erase the past. The apartment was sparse functional, a reflection of the life Emily had built since her dreams of music stardom crumbled in Boston. A second-hand couch, a shelf of sheet music, a guitar she rarely touched anymore. The painting Clara Bennett had left sat propped against the wall, its cornfield glowing under the dim light, the woman's silhouette a haunting echo of the girl Emily used to be. She'd meant to give it away, to shove it in a closet where it couldn't stir the memories she'd worked so hard to bury. But every time she looked at it, she saw the Maplewood fields, her father's porch, the way he'd watch her with a sketchbook in hand. His eyes soft with a love she thought would last forever. Until it didn't. Emily paced the small room, her fingers brushing the piano keys she kept for teaching their cool surface grounding her. Clara's visit last week had shaken something loose, a crack in the walls she'd built to keep her father out. He regrets it, Clara had said, her voice steady but kind, as if she understood the ache of broken ties. Emily hadn't wanted to hear it, then hadn't wanted to believe that her father's regret could change anything. But the painting with its inscription, "For Emily," my light in the dark, had stayed with her, whispering through the quiet nights, pulling her back to a time when she'd felt invincible singing to the corn, as if it were a crowd. She picked up the envelope again, her hands unsteady. Part of her wanted to tear it open, to read the words she'd spent years imagining, words of apology, of love, of anything that might heal the wound he'd left. But another part, the part that had survived rejection and failure, wanted to throw it away, to keep the wall between them intact. She thought of her mother gone when Emily was 5, a faint memory of laughter and lavender. Arthur had been her anchor after that, his paintings filling their home with color, his stories filling her heart with dreams. But when she'd told him she wanted to sing to chase stages instead of cornfields, his face had hardened, his voice sharp with fear disguised as judgment. You're throwing your life away, he'd said, and Emily had fled, proving him wrong until the world proved her wrong instead. The letter felt heavier now, a stone pulling her toward a past she wasn't sure she could face. She sat at the kitchen table, the envelope before her, and finally slid it open with a butter knife. The paper inside was plain, the handwriting shaky but familiar, each word a bridge across 17 years. Dear Emily, it began. I don't know if you'll read this or if you'll care, but I need you to know I was wrong. I was scared for you, scared the world would break you the way it broke so many others. But I broke you first, and I've carried that every day since you left. You were my light, my reason for painting, for breathing. I'm so sorry, Emily. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. I'll always be here. Love, Dad. Emily's vision blurred, tears falling onto the paper, smudging the ink. She pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob that rose from somewhere deep, a place she'd locked away when she'd stopped singing. The letter was everything she'd wanted and everything she feared, a confession, an apology, a door she wasn't sure she could walk through. She thought of Clara, the stranger who'd carried this painting across Vermont, who'd looked at her with eyes that seemed to understand loss. Emily hadn't asked why Clara cared so much. But now, holding her father's words, she felt a flicker of gratitude and something else, hope fragile as a new note. She stood crossing to the painting, her fingers tracing the woman's silhouette. It was her, she realized, or the version of her Arthur had seen, a girl full of light running through cornfields, her dreams as vast as the sky. She'd stopped being that girl somewhere along the way, her voice silenced by failure and fear. But the painting held that light, and so did her father's letter. Emily grabbed a notebook from her shelf, her hands moving before her mind could catch up. She wrote the words spilling out like a song she'd forgotten she knew Dad. I read your letter. I'm still hurt, but I miss you. I don't know if I'm ready, but I want to try. She stopped her pen hovering over the page. The words felt raw, exposed, like stepping onto a stage after years of silence. She folded the letter, but didn't seal it, setting it beside the painting. She wasn't ready to send it, not yet. Instead, she drove to Maplewood, the painting in her back seat drawn to the old Harrison house where Clara had found it. The house stood quiet under the stars, its windows dark, but the attic windows seemed to glow faintly, as if holding a secret. Emily climbed the stairs, her footsteps echoing, and left the letter in the attic tucked beside a dusty trunk. As she drove back to Burlington, the night air cool against her face, Emily felt lighter, as if the letter had lifted a weight she hadn't known she was carrying. The painting's whisper lingered a melody she couldn't yet sing, but was beginning to hear. She didn't know if she'd send the letter or if she'd see her father again, but for the first time in years, the possibility felt real. And somewhere in the quiet of Maplewood, the painting waited its story unfinished, its light still burning in the dark. The old Harrison house stood silent under the gray September sky, its weathered shingles blending into the muted hues of Maplewood's autumn. Clara Bennett parked her truck in the driveway, the familiar crunch of gravel under her tires, grounding her against the nervous flutter in her chest. She'd come to finish the paint job to cover the last of the faded walls with a fresh coat of beige, as the realtor had requested. But the house felt different now, heavier, as if it knew the secrets it held. The painting was gone, left with Emily in Burlington, but its whisper lingered in Clara's mind, pulling her back to the attic where it all began. She wasn't sure why she felt compelled to check the attic again. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was the ache of her own unresolved past, pushing her to keep searching. Inside, the house smelled of fresh paint and old wood, a mix of renewal and decay. Clara climbed the narrow staircase, her boots echoing in the quiet, and pushed open the attic door. The space was as she'd left it, a cavern of dust and shadows, the air thick with the scent of forgotten things. Her flashlight beam swept across the familiar clutter boxes, a cracked mirror, the pile of blankets where she'd found the painting. But something caught her eye, a small white square tucked against a dusty trunk, half hidden in the dim light. Clara knelt, her heart quickening as she picked it up. An envelope unsealed with no address, just a single word scrawled on the front. Her breath caught. She opened the flap, pulling out a single sheet of paper, the handwriting neat but trembling, as if written in a rush of emotion. Dad, I read your letter. I'm still hurt, but I miss you. I don't know if I'm ready, but I want to try. The signature was simple, Emily. Clara's eyes stung, a wave of hope and fear washing over her. Emily had been here in this attic, leaving her reply where the painting had been found, as if the house itself were a bridge between her and Arthur. Clara clutched the letter, her mind racing. This was more than a clue. It was a crack in the wall Emily had built, a chance to bring her and Arthur together. She sat back on her heels, the attic's silence pressing in. She thought of her own father, Richard, the way his curt voice had shut her out on the phone, the years of silence that had grown between them since her mother's death. Clara had tried to reach him to bridge that gap, but his rejection had left her raw, uncertain. Yet here in Emily's words was a flicker of possibility, a daughter who still loved her father, despite the pain. Clara's resolve hardened. She couldn't force Emily to forgive Arthur, just as she couldn't force her own father to open up. But she could give them a chance, a moment to face each other, to see if the painting's whisper could become a voice, Clara tucked the letter into her jacket, her mind already spinning a plan. She'd bring Arthur and Emily here to the Harrison house, to the attic, where the painting had waited all those years. It wasn't neutral ground, too many memories lingered in these walls, but it was fitting a place where their story had been unearthed. She'd tell them she needed their help to decide what to do with the painting, that the local historical society was interested in displaying it. It was a half-truth, but it would get them here together in the same room with the canvas that held their shared past. She drove back to Maplewood, the letter burning a hole in her pocket. At her apartment, she sat at the kitchen table, her mother's shoebox of sketches open before her. The drawings felt alive now, their lines whispering of Ellen's love, her dreams for Clara. Clara picked up her sketch pad, her pencil moving across the page, tracing the outline of the Harrison house, its attic window glowing under a starry sky. She wasn't an artist, not like her mother or Arthur. But the act of drawing felt like a conversation, a way to hold on to the hope she'd found in Emily's letter. She called Arthur first, her voice steady as she explained her plan. The Historical Society wants to see the painting. She said, the lie slipping out easier than she'd expected. They need your input, and Emily's, since it's her painting too. Can you come to the Harrison house tomorrow? Arthur hesitated, his breath heavy over the phone. Emily will be there? He asked, his voice thick with equal parts hope and dread. Yes, Clara said, praying she wasn't promising too much. She'll be there. Next, she called Emily, her fingers trembling as she dialed the school's number. It's Clara, she said, when Emily answered, her voice cautious but curious. The Maplewood Historical Society is interested in your dad's painting. They want to talk to you and him about displaying it. Can you come to the old Harrison house tomorrow afternoon? There was a long pause, the kind that made Clara's heart pound. I don't know, Emily said finally. I'm not sure I can face him. Clara swallowed, thinking of her own father, the call she'd made, the door that had stayed closed. You don't have to decide anything, she said. Just come, for the painting. Emily agreed, her voice quiet but resolute. Clara hung up her hands, shaking with the weight of what she'd set in motion. She looked at her sketch pad, the drawing of the house staring back at her, its attic window, a beacon in the dark. She thought of her mother, the way she'd always said to look closely to see the details others missed. Clara was looking now, seeing the threads that connected her to Arthur, to Emily, to the painting that had started it all. Tomorrow she'd bring them together, and whatever happened, forgiveness, anger, or something in between, she'd know she'd tried. As the stars blinked to life outside her window, Clara felt the painting's whisper in her heart, urging her toward a moment that might change everything. The attic of the Harrison house was a cocoon of dust and memory, its slanted ceiling trapping the late afternoon light in soft golden pools. Clara Bennett stood by the attic window, her heart pounding as she arranged the painting on an old crate, its cornfield glowing under the dim glow of a single bulb. The woman in the canvas seemed to watch her, her silhouette a silent witness to the moment Clara had orchestrated. She'd lied to bring Arthur and Emily here, telling them the Maplewood Historical Society needed their input on the painting's future. The truth was simpler and heavier. She needed them to see each other, to face the years of pain and love that the painting held. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the canvas, the weight of her own unresolved past, her mother's sketches, her father's silence pressing against her ribs. The creak of the stairs broke the silence, and Clara turned to see Arthur Hayes climbing into the attic. His steps slow, his silver hair catching the light. His eyes found the painting first, a flicker of pain crossing his face before he looked at Clara. You said Emily would be here, he said, his voice rough, laced with a hope he didn't dare trust. Clara nodded, her throat tight. She's coming, she said, praying it was true. Arthur's hands clenched at his sides, his gaze drifting to the painting, to the inscription he'd written 17 years ago for Emily, my light in the dark. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to leap or retreat. Another creak, sharper this time, and Emily appeared at the top of the stairs, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders, her hazel eyes wide with something between fear and resolve. She froze when she saw Arthur, her breath catching the air between them, thick with unspoken history. Clara stepped back, her presence fading into the shadows of the attic, giving them space. For a moment, no one spoke. The painting stood between them, its cornfield a bridge across the years, its colors vibrant against the attic's decay. Arthur's lips parted, but no words came, only a soft exhale like a prayer he'd forgotten how to say. "Dad?" Emily said finally, her voice barely audible, trembling with a mix of anger and longing. Arthur's eyes glistened, his hands unclenching as if reaching for something he couldn't quite touch. "Emily," he whispered the word, breaking in his throat. I didn't think you'd come." Emily's gaze flickered to the painting, her fingers twitching at her sides. Clara said it was about the painting. She said her tone guarded, but her eyes betrayed her softening as they traced the woman in the cornfield. "She said you wanted to talk." Arthur glanced at Clara, a flash of understanding in his eyes. He knew she'd stretched the truth to bring them here. He took a step forward, his voice low, raw. "I wrote you that letter," he said. "I meant every word. I was wrong, Emily. I was so wrong to tell you your dreams were foolish. I was scared for you, scared you'd get hurt. But I hurt you worse. I've regretted it every day since you left." Emily's face crumpled, a tear slipping down her cheek. She crossed her arms as if to hold herself together, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "You didn't just say it was foolish, Dad. You said I wasn't good enough, that I'd fail. And when I did, when the record deal fell through, I heard your voice in my head telling me I was nothing." Her words cut through the attic, sharp and heavy, and Arthur flinched, his shoulders sagging under their weight. Clara's heart ached, her own memories of her father's silence echoing Emily's pain. She wanted to speak to bridge the gap, but this wasn't her moment. "I know," Arthur said, his voice breaking. "I know what I did. I thought I was protecting you, but I was protecting myself, scared of losing you to a world I couldn't control. You were my light, Emily. Every painting, every stroke was for you. When you left, I stopped painting. I couldn't see the colors anymore." He gestured to the canvas, his hand trembling. "That was you running through the fields, singing like the world was yours. I wanted to keep that forever. I failed you, but I never stopped loving you." Emily's tears fell freely now, her arms dropping to her sides. She stepped closer to the painting, her fingers brushing its edge as if touching it could bring back the girl she'd been. "I wanted you to be proud of me," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "I sang for you, Dad. Every song was for you, even when I left. But you made me feel like I wasn't enough." Arthur moved toward her, hesitant, as if afraid she'd vanish. "You were always enough," he said. "I was the one who wasn't. I'm so sorry, Emily." The attic seemed to hold its breath, the silence heavy with years of hurt and love. Emily looked at her father, her eyes searching his face, and then with a sob she closed the distance between them, falling into his arms. Arthur held her tightly, his own tears falling into her hair, his body shaking with the weight of 17 years apart. "I missed you," Emily whispered, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I missed you too." Arthur said his words, a vow, a promise to start again. Clara stood frozen, her own tears spilling over as she watched them. She thought of her mother Ellen, the sketches that had captured a love she'd lost too soon. She thought of her father Richard, the silence that had grown between them, the call that had ended in rejection. This moment, Arthur and Emily clinging to each other in the attic's dim light, was what she'd been chasing, not just for them, but for herself. The painting had brought them here, its whisper louder than ever, a song of forgiveness and hope. As Arthur and Emily pulled back, their faces wet but softened, they turned to the painting, their hands still touching, as if afraid to let go. "What do we do with it?" Emily asked, her voice steady now, a smile breaking through her tears. Arthur looked at Clara, his eyes grateful. "We keep it," he said. "We make it new." Clara nodded, her heart full, knowing this was only the beginning. The painting had done its work, but the story wasn't over. As the light faded outside, casting the attic in a warm golden glow, Clara felt the whispers shift, not just a call to the past, but a promise of something new. The old painting with its lonely woman standing in a cornfield was no longer confined to the dusty attic. Arthur had placed it in his workshop, using it as inspiration for a new work. The scent of pine and oil paint, once a smell of solitude, was now the fragrance of hope. Arthur and Emily, father and daughter, stood together before a fresh canvas, brushes in hand. "I remember you used to say, every brushstroke tells a story," Emily said softly, her eyes sparkling as she looked at her father. Arthur smiled, a rare and warm smile that Emily hadn't seen in years. "And now we'll tell a new story, together. Our story." The new painting was still set in a Vermont cornfield, but it no longer depicted a solitary woman. This time there were two people standing side by side, an old man with gray hair and a grown woman, both gazing toward the horizon. Arthur's brushstrokes were still strong and somber, while Emily's were soft and flowing. They painted not just with skill, but with the emotions and love they had buried for so long. Clara often visited the workshop. She wasn't just the one who brought them together, but a part of their story. She listened as Arthur told Emily about his early days as an artist, the stories of his inspiration and his mistakes. Emily, in turn, shared the music she had composed, the feelings she poured into every note, and the regrets she had felt after giving up her dream. Clara listened in silence, feeling the healing spread through the air. As the painting neared completion, Clara had an idea. She suggested a small exhibition at Maplewood's annual autumn art fair. At first, Arthur and Emily were hesitant. They didn't want to expose their private story to the public. But Clara convinced them, this isn't just a painting. It's proof of love and forgiveness. It could inspire so many people. And so, on a windy Saturday in October, the painting titled "The Homecoming" was displayed at the Maplewood Art Fair. Town residents who had been familiar with Arthur's work many years ago stood before the painting with moved expressions. They saw not just a work of art, but a story of a family's love being restored. An old woman who sold jam, the same one who had told Clara about Arthur, stood by the painting and wiped away a tear. "I thought he would never find his daughter again." The exhibition was a huge success. Not just artistically, but in terms of community. The entire town of Maplewood witnessed and shared in Arthur and Emily's happiness. A young woman, after hearing their story, approached Emily and shared a story of her own conflict with her mother. Emily embraced her and advised her not to let regret become a wall between them. Clara watched from a distance, feeling a profound sense of relief. Her mission was complete. Her gaze rested on Arthur and Emily, who were now smiling and chatting happily with everyone. Suddenly, her phone vibrated. A new message, not for work, but from an unfamiliar number. "I heard about your story, about what you did for Arthur and his daughter. I want to talk to you. Can you come visit me in Boston?" Clara read the message over and over, her hand trembling. A familiar feeling, an old pain, was suddenly replaced by a warm spark, like the sunlight streaming into the attic that day. She realized that her journey to help others find love had unintentionally opened a door for her to find her own way home. The train ride from Maplewood to Boston was a blur of changing scenery. The fiery reds and golds of Vermont's autumn forests gradually gave way to the sprawling suburbs and the dense urban landscape of the city. In her hands, Clara held the painting that Arthur had gifted her. It was a small, vibrant piece, a miniature version of the cornfield from the original painting, but with two figures standing side by side, their backs to the viewer, just as he and Emily had depicted themselves. It was a symbol of their renewed bond, a story of forgiveness, and Clara knew it was the perfect offering for her own father. The apartment building in the North End felt both familiar and foreign. It had been years since she'd been there, not since before her mother's accident. The scent of old wood and Italian cooking from the ground floor restaurants was a nostalgic comfort. She took a deep breath before knocking on the door. Her father, David Bennett, opened it. He looked older, his face etched with a mix of weariness and something Clara couldn't quite place, a hint of hope. The years of silence had built a wall between them, a silent agreement not to talk about the past. But now, as he saw the painting in her hands, that wall seemed to crack. "Clara," he said, his voice a little hoarse. "Come in." The apartment was filled with her mother's things. A small easel stood in a corner, a half-finished canvas still on it, covered by a sheet. Photos of her mother dotted the shelves and walls. Clara's gaze fixed on a particular photo, her mother laughing with a streak of paint on her cheek. It was a memory Clara had almost forgotten. They sat at the kitchen table, the small painting resting between them. Clara began to tell him the story of Arthur and Emily. She didn't hold back, detailing the discovery of the painting, the hunt for its artist, the difficult conversations, and the emotional reunion. She spoke of how she felt a connection to their story, how their pain mirrored her own. Her father listened intently, his eyes fixed on the painting. When she finished, a long silence filled the room. "I was so angry," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "Angry at your mother for leaving us. Angry at myself for not being there. I couldn't bear to look at her paintings. Couldn't bear to look at you. Because you looked so much like her." He got up and walked to the easel, gently lifting the sheet. Clara saw a familiar scene, a portrait of a young girl, her own face, smiling at the camera. It was a painting her mother had started, but never finished. "She was painting this for your birthday," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "She was so excited. But after, I just couldn't finish it. I put all my energy into work, into forgetting. I let a wall grow between us, just like Arthur did with Emily." Tears streamed down Clara's face, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief. For the first time, she was seeing her father not as a distant figure, but as a man who had also been broken by grief. He wasn't cold. He was just lost. He returned to the table and with a trembling hand reached for the painting from Arthur. Arthur Hayes. He found his light again. Maybe we can too. For the first time in years, they talked about her mother, about her life, her love of art, her dreams. Clara shared memories she had suppressed for so long, and her father added details she had never known. The distance between them, which had once felt insurmountable, began to shrink with every word. When Clara left Boston, the air felt lighter. She still carried Arthur's painting, but it was no longer a burden. It was a reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal. Back in her small apartment in Maplewood, she hung the painting on the wall, a symbol of not just Arthur and Emily's homecoming, but her own. A year passed. Clara Bennett was no longer the quiet, solitary house painter she had been. She was a permanent fixture in Maplewood, a woman who had found her place and her purpose. Her work still involved paint, but her canvas had grown. With the help of Emily, she had started offering art classes for children at the local community center. The cheerful chaos of smudged paint, tiny hands, and giggling voices filled the room, a stark contrast to the silent, dusty attic where her journey had begun. Arthur and Emily had truly found their new beginning. They lived in separate houses, but were never far from each other. Their days were spent in the rhythmic companionship of the workshop where new paintings and melodies were born. They held an annual art show at the Maplewood Fair, a popular event that had become a local tradition. This year, the main attraction was a large, vibrant painting they had created together, depicting a blooming cornfield filled with music notes swirling in the air. Their story, once a private tragedy, was now a public testament to the power of forgiveness and love. Clara, too, had started painting again, not as a job, but as an expression of her own healing. She found herself drawn to the same themes her mother had loved: sun-drenched fields, old houses with character, and the subtle beauty of everyday life in Vermont. One afternoon, as she worked on a new canvas, she found herself reminiscing about the last year, the mystery of the old painting, the drive to the Green Mountains, the quiet hope in Arthur's eyes, and the final tearful embrace. She thought of her father, with whom she now spoke weekly, sharing stories and slowly rebuilding the bridge between them. The phone calls were no longer filled with silence, but with the warm echoes of a family coming back together. She stood back from her painting. It was a simple piece, yet it felt more complete than anything she had ever done. It depicted a sun-drenched attic with a beam of light illuminating a single empty space where a painting once hung. It was a tribute to the past, but it felt entirely new. A whisper of her mother's encouragement seemed to fill the room, not with sadness, but with pride. Taking a deep breath, Clara picked up a pen. On the back of the canvas, she wrote a simple dedication. It was not a message of pain or regret, but of gratitude and hope, a final thought that encapsulated everything she had learned. For those who find light in the shadows.